What would happen if the real owner of a luxury apartment complex was mistaken for an intruder? What would unfold next? Have you ever thought that a man in a simple t-shirt, quietly reading a book by the pool, could shake an entire elite community? And what if he wasn't just an ordinary man, but the very person who built that place? That afternoon, at Horizon Heights, the most luxurious apartment complex in the city, what seemed like a small confrontation turned into a media storm. And the man named Ethan Ward taught everyone an expensive lesson. Respect is not a privilege. It is something every human being deserves. That afternoon, the surface of the Horizon Heights pool was as still as a giant mirror reflecting the deep blue sky. The late sunlight shimmered across the tiny ripples, evoking a sense of luxury and tranquility that few places could match. Ethan Ward sat on a lounge chair near the edge of the water, his demeanor calm, as if he didn't belong to the constant tension and calculations of the elite world. A light grey t-shirt, navy swim trunks, simple flip-flops, and an open book titled Strategic Leadership in Crisis resting in his hands. Everything about him made him look like any ordinary guest spending a leisurely afternoon here. But if one looked closely, there was something about Ethan that was hard to define, a depth in his eyes, an air of authority belonging to someone who had long been accustomed to making decisions that shaped the fate of entire corporations. He set the book down on the small table beside him, perfectly aligned, a habit shaped by years of running meticulous boardroom meetings. Perhaps it was this absolute composure that made him stand out among those around him. Because in this place, where Hermes bags and Rolex watches were the passports to social acceptance, his simplicity was like an unspoken challenge to the unwritten rules that had existed for far too long. A gentle breeze drifted past, carrying with it the low hum of conversation and laughter from groups of residents across the pool. They stole glances at him, some with mild irritation, others whispering as if questioning who this man was and how he had gained access to this exclusive haven. Among those curious eyes, no one knew that in just a few minutes, what seemed like a trivial encounter would spark an unprecedented media storm, and this unassuming man would force the entire Horizon Heights community to take a hard look at itself. He remained seated, one hand resting on the corner of the folded page, the other tapping rhythmically on the armrest, as if savoring the calm. But to those perceptive enough, every small gesture carried the weight of expectation, as if he were waiting for something, a moment that would change everything. And that moment was now closer than ever. The sharp rhythm of heels striking against the marble floor cut through the serene atmosphere around the pool. Sophia Grant appeared, her expression carrying the sternness of someone far too accustomed to authority. She wore a navy blue dress, perfectly tailored, and held a clipboard in her hand, like a weapon to assert her power. Walking just behind her was Victor Hale, the towering security guard with sharp, watchful eyes, a man every staff member knew would never overlook even the smallest breach of rules. Each of their steps seemed to mark their territory, and when they finally stopped in front of Ethan Ward, Sophia's disdainful gaze swept over him from head to toe. She didn't bother hiding her suspicion, as her firm voice carried loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Excuse me. This pool is reserved for registered residents only. I don't see your name on the list." Victor glanced at his phone, his hands gripping his radio tightly, his eyes scanning Ethan as if the man had just stepped into a restricted area. Ethan looked up, a calm smile flickering briefly across his face, his deep, steady gaze betraying the fact that he was not someone easily intimidated. "I live here," he said. Sophia let out a faint, mocking laugh, a sharp, condescending sound. "Live here? Which tower? Certainly not the main one." She raised her voice deliberately, making sure everyone by the pool could hear. Curious eyes began to turn toward them, whispers spreading like ripples on water. "He doesn't look like someone who lives here. Probably just wandered in by mistake." The curiosity grew, and more eyes fixed on Ethan. But he didn't move, didn't shift in discomfort, and his calm, unwavering gaze directed at Sophia only made her irritation grow. She was used to people bowing their heads and obeying without question, not to someone who sat still and stared back at her with a faint, unreadable smile, as if everything was unfolding exactly as he expected. Victor glanced at Sophia, his hand already resting on his radio, ready to report at any moment. The air seemed to grow heavier, and someone in the crowd quietly raised a phone to record, unaware that the video would soon become the talk of the entire city. Ethan, his expression unchanged, tilted his head slightly. "If you'd like, I can explain later," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "But I'm quite certain I'm not sitting in the wrong place." The words were soft, but they landed like a quiet challenge, and in that moment, Sophia's patience began to fray. Just minutes after the confrontation, the atmosphere around the Horizon Heights pool had completely shifted. The cheerful conversations over cocktails gradually faded, replaced by cautious glances and hushed whispers. The first message popped up on the resident's internal app. "There's a stranger sitting in the premium pool area. Not sure if he's a resident." That was all it took for a flood of comments to follow. Chloe Morgan, the woman who proudly called herself the icon of luxury living in the complex, peeked over the top of her thick novel, squinting with satisfaction as if she were about to witness a thrilling scandal unfold. The Ramos family, who had just brought their young child to the kids' pool, paused along the walkway, exchanging a knowing look that silently implied, "He doesn't look like he belongs here, does he?" Near the maintenance area, two technicians stopped what they were doing, leaning against the wall, their faces tense as they observed. Each glance, each whisper, felt like poison slowly seeping through the air, making the atmosphere grow heavier by the second. Victor Hale leaned in, entering information into his phone, his voice low but clear enough to be heard in the tense silence. "No Ethan Ward on the pool registration list for today." Sophia Grant's smile curled into one of triumph, her face glowing with self-satisfaction. "See? The new rule requires all residents to register 24 hours in advance. Clearly, you're not aware of the regulations." Ethan raised an eyebrow, showing a hint of surprise for the first time, though it wasn't the startled reaction of someone caught off guard. It was more like a man who had just discovered an interesting detail in a game of chess. His voice was calm, but loud enough for everyone to hear as he asked slowly, "When exactly was this rule passed?" That simple question caused Sophia to freeze for a moment, her eyes darting quickly to Victor, as if seeking confirmation. Around them, the murmurs grew louder. A man reclining on a nearby lounge chair whispered to his wife, "That's strange. I haven't heard of this rule either." A young woman muttered under her breath. Maybe they're just trying to pick on him. Still, most people sided with Sophia. In a place like this, anyone who didn't fit the right image was often automatically seen as being in the wrong. Meanwhile, a teenage boy quickly pulled out his phone, excitedly recording the entire scene. His face lit up with anticipation as he whispered, "This is going to blow up in the residents' group." He didn't know that this very video would soon leave the confines of the community chat and become a viral sensation across social media. Ethan remained seated, one hand resting on his book, the other tapping lightly on the armrest. His eyes swept over the growing crowd, showing no sign of pressure. On the contrary, he looked as if he were observing them, assessing them. It felt as though he was the one judging every single person there, not the other way around. And that calm, almost cold composure made a few in the crowd shift uncomfortably. In a place where power usually belonged to those with money and loud voices, his unshakable poise felt like an invisible slap to their pride. The atmosphere around the pool seemed to grow heavier, every word and every glance carrying an undeniable tension. Sophia Grant stood with her arms crossed, her high heels tapping rhythmically against the tile floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down to a major confrontation. She lifted her chin, her voice sharp and commanding. "We can't make exceptions. Rules are rules. Here, everyone must comply, especially—" She deliberately left the sentence unfinished, but her eyes swept over Ethan from his simple hair, past the unbranded clothes, down to the plain flip-flops, as if to emphasize that he didn't belong in this place. Victor Hale kept his cold expression, one hand already resting on his radio, ready to call for backup. Speaking into his phone loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Unit 9, main pool area, possible unauthorized entry. Need further verification." Some residents whispered to each other. A few nodded in agreement, while others stepped back to distance themselves from the incident. Parents quickly pulled their children away from where they had been playing, creating an invisible circle of space around Ethan, as if he were at the center of a criminal investigation. Ethan remained seated, showing no signs of discomfort. He calmly closed his book, carefully folding the corner of the page, placing it neatly on the table before slowly lifting his head. His voice wasn't raised or aggressive, but it carried clearly through the silence. "I understand you're just doing your job, but I want to hear precisely which rule requires residents to register 24 hours in advance to use the pool?" The question struck Sophia like an arrow. She froze for a brief moment, glancing quickly at Victor, while he lowered his head to his phone, scrolling quickly through the internal app to find an answer. But the silence that stretched for just a few seconds was enough for the murmurs to grow louder. A middle-aged woman whispered to her husband, "Honestly, I've never seen any such announcement." A young man muttered to his friend, "If he's actually a resident, they're in serious trouble." Sophia gripped her clipboard tightly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping hard against the plastic surface, the sharp sound cutting through the tense air. She regained her composure, raising her voice with forced confidence. "This rule was passed recently. We haven't had time to circulate it widely. But in a community like this, we can't allow just anyone to walk in whenever they please." Her emphasis on the words "just anyone" wasn't just a defense of the rules. It was a thinly veiled jab at Ethan's worth and status. A few residents nearby shook their heads, some turning their phones toward Sophia and Victor, now recording the unfolding scene. The air was chaotic despite the silence. Murmurs, annoyed glances, and even a few mocking smiles. Through it all, Ethan remained calm, his eyes quietly observing everyone, as if memorizing every detail for something much bigger. And it was that unwavering composure that made a few people in the crowd begin to doubt whether they had judged this man too quickly. The sound of polished leather shoes echoed, spreading an unusual silence across the pool area. Richard Collins, president of the Residents' Council, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair and the smug smile of someone too accustomed to being revered, approached. The late afternoon sun glinted off the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, as if asserting his status and authority. Following Richard were several other council members, silent but with looks that spoke volumes. They were here to deal with the man deemed to be disrupting the community's order. Sophia Grant immediately stepped back, her tense face softening into relief as her powerful ally arrived. "Richard," she said confidently, "this is someone who isn't on the pool registration list. I told him." "But—" Richard raised his hand, signaling her to stop talking. His eyes locked on Ethan Ward, scanning him from the flip-flops to the neatly placed book on the table. "You say you live here?" Richard asked, his voice low and dripping with condescension. Ethan nodded calmly, his tone steady. "Yes." Richard smirked, leaning slightly closer as if to emphasize every word. "I've lived here for 5 years. I know every resident in this premium area, and I've never seen you before." He paused briefly before continuing, this time speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is a place for people who have worked their entire lives to earn their place here. You think you can sit here, by this pool, just because you want to?" The words sliced through the air like a blade. A few in the crowd nodded in agreement, some even smiling with disdain. A woman whispered to her friend, "He clearly doesn't belong here." Ethan remained composed, his gaze calm, not rushing to respond. He placed his hand on the book, slowly turning his face to look Richard directly in the eye. "In the 30 minutes I've been now sitting here," he said, his voice steady and clear, "at least 10 people have come to this pool without anyone asking for registration or identification. But only I was asked to prove myself. Why is that?" Richard hesitated for a split second, a flicker of irritation crossing his eyes. But instead of answering, he let out a sharp laugh. Bitter and dismissive. "Don't compare yourself to the residents here. They are people we know, people who understand what community standards are." Sophia quickly chimed in. "Yes, we can't let the standards be lowered." Their words, meant to assert authority, instead weighed down the atmosphere even further. Some of the younger residents began exchanging glances, a few quietly shaking their heads. A teenager recording the scene whispered to his friend, "He's talking like he owns this place." But to Richard, that didn't matter. He was used to no one daring to challenge him. What he didn't realize was that his words were pushing the situation closer to the breaking point. Ethan sat there in silence for a long moment, his deep eyes revealing nothing. But anyone truly observant could sense something shifting. He was no longer just a resident being harassed. He looked like a man waiting for the right moment to place the decisive piece in a game of chess he had been planning all along. A gentle breeze swept across the surface of the pool, carrying with it the weight of curious and tense stares, all fixed on the man sitting calmly on the lounge chair. Ethan Ward lifted his phone, his movement so composed it felt almost like a challenge to every suspicious look directed his way. He unlocked the screen, his fingers moving swiftly as he typed a few words, and his voice, deep and steady, carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "Activate Protocol 9. Record the entire pool area immediately." Sophia Grant's brow furrowed, the confident smile on her lips faltering for the first time. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with tension, though she still tried to maintain her air of superiority. Ethan looked up at her, his gaze calm, yet impossibly deep, unreadable. "I just want to clarify a few things," he said evenly, his tone measured. "I believe transparency is good for everyone, isn't it?" His response made Sophia briefly lose control of her expression, while Richard Collins, standing beside her, let out a dismissive chuckle, masking a flicker of unease with a posture of arrogance, arms crossed as he said, "You think one phone call will change anything?" Victor Hale's hand remained on his radio, but his eyes wavered slightly, betraying hesitation. Some of the residents in the crowd began whispering to each other. A few raised their phones to record close-ups, realizing this was turning into something far more intriguing than they had anticipated. A young woman murmured to her friend, "He doesn't look like someone who's easily intimidated. He seems very confident." Ethan maintained his strangely unnerving composure. He no longer looked at his phone, instead letting his gaze sweep slowly across every face in the crowd, as if silently studying and memorizing each one. A notification tone sounded, and Ethan glanced briefly at the screen before placing the phone down on the table, making no attempt to hide it. The glowing display read, "Recording activated. All data will be stored on the central system." Sophia stared at the screen, her heartbeat quickening, though she tried to keep her voice sharp. "Do you think you're intimidating us? There are rules here, and no one is allowed to break them." But her words carried less conviction than before. Richard, on the other hand, clung stubbornly to his arrogance, scoffing, "He's just putting on a show. Call for backup, Victor." Victor was about to lift his radio when a clear voice rose from the crowd, cutting through the tension. "Wait, what if he really is a resident? Maybe we're blowing this out of proportion." An elderly woman sitting nearby nodded in agreement, adding, "She's right. I've never heard of any rule requiring advance registration to swim." The murmurs grew louder, with more skeptical glances now directed at Sophia and Richard. Ethan leaned back against his chair, his fingers interlaced in front of him, a faint smile crossing his lips, as if watching a chess game unfold exactly as he had planned. He didn't say another word, but his silence felt heavier than any argument could. And in the next few moments, none of them could have predicted that the truth was about to be revealed in the most shocking way possible. The crackling sound of Victor Hale's radio abruptly shattered the heavy tension that had settled over the poolside. "Unit 9, confirm resident information for a man named Ethan Ward," came the voice on the other end, calm at first. But only a few seconds later, the tone changed, sharp with disbelief, making everyone hold their breath. "Did you just say Ethan Ward? Repeat, Ethan Ward!" Victor frowned, pressing the button firmly. "Yes, Ethan Ward. Confirm whether this man actually resides at Horizon Heights." A long, tense pause followed before the voice returned, now laced with urgency and a hint of panic. "Unit 9, stop immediately. Ethan Ward is a registered resident. He is the primary investor of the entire Horizon Heights project. He lives in Penthouse 001. The words hit like a thunderclap tearing through the calm sky. Murmurs erupted instantly, spreading like wildfire. Sophia Grant stood frozen, her face draining of color, while Richard Collins, who had moments ago stood confidently with his arms crossed, now stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line as if refusing to believe what he had just heard. A woman in the crowd gasped, "Ethan Ward? Do they mean that Ethan Ward, CEO of Ward Industries?" Phones were whipped out in unison, fingers tapping furiously. Within seconds, the glow of multiple screens lit up faces now shifting with shock. His name dominated every search result. Ethan Ward, tech billionaire, CEO of Ward Industries, the visionary behind some of the city's largest community development projects. A young woman whispered, almost in awe, "He's the one who funded this entire place, even this pool." A young man standing nearby exhaled sharply. "My God, we just watched the owner of this place get humiliated." Sophia stumbled back a step, gripping her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She tried to steady her voice. I didn't know." But her feeble excuse was drowned out by the rising tide of whispers. Richard Collins, once the embodiment of unshakable authority, now looked like a man stripped bare in front of his own audience. He attempted to recover, speaking with forced calm. "Mr. Ward, this is just a small misunderstanding." But the cold, unwavering stare from Ethan silenced him instantly. Ethan remained seated, his posture relaxed, yet the look in his deep-set eyes had shifted completely. Gone was the harmless calm from before. Now they carried a sharp, commanding weight, an unspoken warning that hung heavy in the air. Tilting his head slightly, his voice came low but resonant, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. "Interesting. I built this place to be a civilized community, but it seems some people have turned it into a tool to judge others." The entire poolside fell silent. The only sound the faint rustle of the breeze skimming across the water's surface. And in that moment, everyone understood. Everything had just changed. An unusual silence settled over the entire Horizon Heights poolside, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for the reaction of the man whose name alone could shake every contract in this place. Ethan Ward rose slowly to his feet, every movement carrying an invisible authority. He picked up his phone, dialed a quick call, and switched to speaker, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Amanda, prepare a press statement. I want the entire Horizon Heights management team at the pool within 30 minutes, and make sure every piece of video footage from the security system is preserved." Sophia Grant stepped back completely, her hand still gripping the clipboard, her face pale and drained of color. Richard Collins, who had just moments ago stood with arms crossed in arrogant confidence, now looked like a student caught red, handed by the headmaster. He forced a strained, awkward smile, his voice trembling. "Mr. Ward, this is just a minor misunderstanding, I assure you." Ethan didn't even glance at him. Instead, he placed a gold-engraved card on the table for everyone to see. "Founding Resident, Penthouse 01. The late afternoon sun reflected off the polished surface, gleaming like an undeniable mark of power. Turning his gaze to the crowd gathered around, Ethan spoke in a tone calm yet strong enough to make even the most arrogant lower their heads. "A misunderstanding? A civilized community cannot be built on judgment and prejudice. I will hear an explanation, but not here, not now. We will talk later, once everything has been properly recorded." Richard tried to step forward, the stiff smile on his face cracking like a mask about to fall apart. "Of course, Mr. Ward, I will." Ethan cut him off, not raising his voice but delivering each word with absolute command. "Good. And Richard, prepare a full written statement. I want no deception in any report." Some of the younger residents, who had previously watched with suspicious eyes, began nodding slightly, and a few even muttered awkward apologies. I didn't know he was Ethan Ward." But Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly at that, his gaze sweeping over them, leaving behind a weight heavier than any scolding. "That shouldn't matter. Respect is not something reserved only for people with a name." Sophia stood frozen, her hands trembling, her eyes darting around as if looking for a way out of the situation. But around her, every look had changed. Those who had sided with her earlier now quietly stepped aside, leaving a growing space around her, a silent sign that she had isolated herself with her own behavior. Ethan sat back down, calmly reopening the book he had left on the table. The simple motion felt like the final period at the end of a chapter, closing the show put on by those who once believed they held the highest authority here. Power had shifted entirely, not seized, but simply returned to where it had always truly belonged. Less than an hour after the confrontation, Horizon Heights was no longer the quiet, exclusive community it had always prided itself on being. Across social media, the video capturing the entire incident spread at lightning speed. Headlines flooded forums and news feeds. CEO Ethan Ward insulted at the very residential complex he funded. Within hours, the views surged past millions, drawing thousands of furious comments. At the pool, residents' phones buzzed non-stop with breaking notifications. A woman whispered in shock, her voice trembling, "My God, this is going to be a massive scandal. What have we done?" Those who had smirked earlier now lowered their heads, unable to look Ethan in the eye. Richard Collins answered a call on the spot, his face draining of color as a cold, firm voice came through on the other end. "Richard, the board will not tolerate the way you handled this. The maintenance contract with your company will be reviewed immediately." His voice faltered, panicked. "Wait. We can discuss this." But the line had already gone dead. Richard lowered the phone, his hand trembling, his expression that of a man who had just received a death sentence. Sophia Grant fared no better. Notifications flooded her inbox from the internal app. "Urgent. The board will hold an emergency session. Sophia Grant is required to immediately suspend all management activities." The clipboard slipped from her fingers as she glanced around in panic, but no one stepped forward to defend her. Residents who had once flattered her now quietly moved aside, leaving her to drown in the suffocating atmosphere of her own making. Victor Hale, who had kept his hand on the radio throughout the ordeal, froze as the sharp voice of a senior manager came through his device. "Victor, you are suspended effective immediately. We will conduct a full review of all security protocols." Sweat dotted his forehead, but before he could respond, Ethan spoke. His voice was calm, steady, yet carried the weight that silenced everyone around. "I don't want anyone losing their job over a mistake that can be corrected. Victor, you don't need to be fired. but the entire security team will undergo retraining. I expect a detailed report in 7 days." Those around exchanged glances, surprised by his composure and restraint. Yet that very calmness made them feel an even deeper shame, because compared to his measured grace, their own actions moments earlier seemed petty and disgraceful. Ethan sat back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the crowd still gathered. It was not angry, not accusatory, but it carried a silent reminder. What had just happened was not an accident, but the result of prejudices that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. The storm brewing outside on social media was only beginning, but the real lesson was already unfolding here, in the uneasy eyes of every person present. The late afternoon sun spilled across the Horizon Heights pool, casting a golden glow over the still water. The once bustling crowd gradually dispersed in silence, leaving behind hurried footsteps and a few uneasy glances. Sophia Grant walked away, with her head lowered, the clipboard she once clutched lying abandoned on the tiled floor, a final punctuation mark to the authority she had once wielded. Richard Collins stood motionless by the walkway, phone still in hand, but he no longer dared to make another call. For the first time, his eyes reflected the fear of a man who had grown too accustomed to standing at the top of power. Ethan Ward remained seated in the same lounge chair, opening the book he had folded earlier, as if the storm that had just passed hadn't disturbed his calm in the slightest. But those who lingered knew this was not indifference. It was the composure of a man who had faced the most high-pressure situations, someone who understood that real change doesn't come from anger, but from cold, deliberate decisions. He slowly raised his head, his voice steady and deep, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "I don't need anyone to apologize for mistaking who I am, because that doesn't matter. What I want you to remember is this: respect is not a privilege reserved for those with money or status. Respect is something every human being deserves, regardless of what they wear, how they look, or where they live." A light breeze swept through, carrying with it bowed heads and quiet, regretful sighs. A little boy standing next to his mother whispered, "Mom, he's not angry, so why does everyone look so ashamed?" The innocent question lingered in the air, making a few adults nearby blush, because they knew the answer was already in their hearts. Ethan smiled faintly, not the smile of a man who had won, but of someone who believed he had planted a seed of change. Closing his book, he looked out at the pool reflecting the brilliant hues of sunset, his voice soft but clear enough for those still present to hear. Changing a community doesn't begin with rules on a board. It begins with how we choose to see and treat each other. He stood, walking away at an unhurried pace, his calm presence leaving those around him in quiet awe. And as his figure disappeared behind the rows of trees, the Horizon Heights pool remained as tranquil as it had been when he arrived. But for those who had witnessed everything, nothing felt the same. They knew this afternoon would be a story retold for years, not just because of the name Ethan Ward, but because of the lesson he left behind. Respect should never be given out of fear or power. It is a choice made by those who want to live with dignity. The story at Horizon Heights is more than just a confrontation. It is a powerful reminder that respect should never depend on status or wealth, but must begin with how we treat each other every single day. Because sometimes a single judgmental glance can destroy an entire civilized community we are trying so hard to build. If you also believe that respect is the truest form of class, hit like to help spread this message, subscribe so you won't miss other inspiring stories, and comment right below this video with 3 words, respect first, to let us know you agree with this.